Well, thanks for staying with News at Prime tonight. I imagine all of us in the country are trying to make sense of the violence that we have been seeing unfolding, and also just the impact of some of these scenes on our mental wealth, our mental health, but most importantly, just people having to come to grips with the fact that their entire lives have been turned upside down. Of course, it comes as other provinces are preparing themselves for possible looting, despite the civil unrest being mainly confined to Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. And we've seen the looters taking to the streets, leaving a massive trail of destruction. To speak to us tonight, Nomfundo Mogapi. I did say that she was with the CSVR. In fact, that title has changed. She is now with the CEO for the Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership. Good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time tonight, Sis Nomfundo. It's a lot. It's a lot on any scale for the country to be dealing with in the midst of this global pandemic, where we seem to have been moving around with, you know, the stench of death around us, and it's everywhere, and this adds to the already state of mourning and the posture of mourning that we've been in over the past year. How do we begin to make sense of this?
Cathy, I think for those of us who've been working with issues of trauma in South Africa for the past 3 decades, this is not surprising. I remember the first time when I had to talk to media about what we call collective trauma and collective violence in South Africa was in 2008, when we were all shocked by the types of violence we saw through the xenophobic violence. And in 2011, we produced a research whilst I was still at CSVR, which was called The Smoke That Falls. And in there, I had mentioned that we have a ticking time bomb in our country. If you combine our trauma, which is historical, it's been transferred to the next generation, it is at a collective level and it is repeated, but it has not been dealt with. If you take that and you combine it with the unresolved socio-economic issues in our country and the lack of transformation of our politics, where you have leaders who are still leading for their trauma, you have a ticking time bomb. And here's the thing, Tracy, that is happening, Cathy, is that when you have such levels of trauma, it's very easy for people to be triggered. I want to throw in a concept that we talk about in trauma, which we call an emotional hijack, which I think is exactly what is happening in our country. An emotional hijack happens when an event triggers a trauma or a pain, and you then operate from what we call your amygdala, which really holds the intensity of the pain and of trauma. And then your brain, your cortex, your frontal lobe that you need for reasoning, for thinking, becomes suspended. And I really think we are in a space of emotional hijack as a country. Our emotions are high. We are really being driven. This event, what happened with our ex-president Zuma, what happened with COVID has just resulted into these heightened emotions where we are seeing the things that we are seeing. And it's so easy for the things to spread because it is a collective trauma. And most people have been so surprised to say, why does just one event in South Africa spread so quickly? But those of us who work with collective trauma, we have actually been seeing this. Cathy, I've been in several meetings with you, in several interviews where I have been saying we have a ticking time bomb in South Africa. And now we have this that most people call the perfect storm, which is really a representation of all the issues we haven't dealt with.
Sis Nomfundo, you have long been warning us about the unresolved trauma of the leaders of this country, and you've again tonight described some of our leaders as leading from trauma. What does that mean? Explain it to us in simple terms and help us understand it in the context of where we find ourselves today and the kind of leadership that we sit with that we then expect to get us out of this situation.
So I think, Tracy, if we are really to go forward as a country, we have to understand that the very architecture of our politics needs to shift. So there are things that was done during the struggle by our leaders which made sense, which they needed to do in order to survive and enable this country to be able to get its freedom. I'm going to use some examples which I think are relevant in relation to what we are seeing now. And the first thing was that you really needed to have this skill to be able to identify the enemy and to fight the enemy. You needed to be as close to your comrades as possible, to actually sacrifice your life, no matter what the circumstances, to stand up for your comrades. And you had to look at the third party and identify it. All of these were coping strategies that made the politics to survive in that time. However, take the very same strategies and you put them in a party that is now in power. Currently, if the focus, and again, we've been hearing this and we've been saying this, that, if your focus is on the enemy or the criminals, you really fail to have the capacity to hear the struggle of the masses on the ground and actually reach out to them. What has been happening now with our ex-president having to go to prison and people saying we are going to sacrifice for him no matter what. And secondly, what our ex-president represents, for most people, they say, for me, he represents my father. The issues of humiliation, the issues of not being hated, of being disregarded, of going to prison, all of these things have actually touched that trauma. So we have an issue of a leadership that they are like wounded soldiers who have been wounded at a psychological level as a result of fighting for our country. And they didn't have the time in trying to build our country to transform their psyche and understand that there has to be a mind shift in leadership. But also then you had the masses. Some of them entered and became elite in our country. But again, as the elites in our country, both the current and the previous elites, there was no transformation to understand that it cannot be that the success of South Africa and our success will be at the expense of others. If we don't use our success to transform other people, we'll have a crisis. And then, Cathy, we have people who've remained, millions of people who've remained socially excluded. And for those people, Cathy, here's what we really have to understand, which I think most people don't understand. They're like, but why such intensity? So for most people, when they remain unemployed, when they remain in poverty, it is like they are re-experiencing the trauma. For young people, it's like they are reliving the traumas of their parents. And the fact that they may not be employed and now COVID comes and puts more restrictions, it's like they are stuck in it. So there is this desperation to get out of the poverty, and therefore they will do things that seem senseless to us and they don't make sense. But this is actually a representation and an eruption of the trauma that we've neglected for such a long time as a society. And Cathy, we've seen it in other countries. We've seen it in Rwanda. We've seen it in Zimbabwe. We've seen it in South Sudan. Those of us who have worked in these countries have been saying, South Africa, please watch, please learn. Otherwise, this is going to come back to us as a country.
How do we begin to deal with the trauma and really ensure that we come out of this situation on the other side, taking as many South Africans with as possible? It requires a national conversation, right? But in order to be able to do that, there must be some recognition and acknowledgement from even those that are making policy that this issue of the trauma of the nation is something that deserves to be given a great deal of attention.
Yeah. So I think, Cathy, of course, currently we have a huge task of saying that, guys, we have all been triggered. We need to deal with the current crisis. And I have been saying that we need to have trauma-informed responses to this violence that we're seeing in our country, to the protest, to this crisis that we have. A trauma-informed response will first of all understand that we need leadership from within the communities, because currently in our heightened state, you are either an enemy or a friend. Even if you might say things that make sense, people won't hear you. So we really need people that are trusted by the protesters to speak to people. Secondly, we need leadership. And here's the thing, Cathy. In our heightened state and in our triggered state or our emotional hijack state, We think that it's either we focus on issues of accountability, so those that are pushing accountability are doing it, but very, very harsh, calling people criminals and hooligans. And then there are those that are focusing on the social justice issues, and they're talking about how people have been excluded. They are also doing it in a very violent and unhealthy ways. It is not an either or, it is both. We still have to hold people accountable, but let us challenge their behavior and not start name calling people. And secondly, then, let us talk to people's pain. Let people understand that those that are in spaces of privilege and leadership, those that can come and speak in TVs, or they understand what it means, Cathy, on a daily basis, to not know what you're going to eat tomorrow, to have these microaggressions on a daily basis where you feel worthless and useless. The pain that those of us that are privileged are feeling now, today, is what a lot of people live with on a daily basis. But I don't think it has sunk deep enough for us, and we've sent enough that message that says, yes, we will hold you to account, but we also understand how we came here, and that something needs to change in our country. And of course, what you're talking about, Cathy, which is more like the medium-term interventions, there has to be a transformation of our politics, a transformation of our socio-economic issues, and of course, a transformation of our psyche as a nation.
Nomfundo Mogapi, I'm going to have to leave it there with you for tonight, and she is the CEO for the Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership. Thank you so much for your particular insights on